Welcome back to the deep dive. Now, if you've ever followed a cold case, you know that feeling, that frustration when weeks or maybe months go by with no answers. But today, we're heading over to Perth, Western Australia. We're going to unpack a case that wasn't just cold, it was an open wound for nearly 2 decades, the Claremont serial killings. And this isn't just about the crime itself. This is really a deep dive into what the state called its biggest, longest running, and most expensive investigation. Our mission here is to figure out how this huge police team, Task Force Macro, struggled for so long, and then how, tiny microscopic evidence fibers, DNA, finally cracked the case and led to a conviction years later.
Yeah, and what's immediately chilling when you look at that period, 1996 and 1997, is just how similar the crimes were. It's quite stark. You have three young women all vanishing from the same small area, the Claremont nightlife district. They've been out socializing, left clubs alone, and then just disappeared. The circumstances just scream predatory targeting.
Let's walk through that timeline because you can almost feel the panic escalating in Perth back then. It must have been awful. First, Sarah Spires. She was just 18. Disappeared January 27th, 1996. She left Club Bayview around 2 a.m.
That's right. And we know she called for a taxi at 2:06 a.m. As for Mosman Park, interestingly, not South Perth where she lived, witnesses saw her waiting, alone, near Sterling Road and Sterling Highway. And they remembered seeing an unidentified car stop nearby.
And then the taxi gets there just 3 minutes later, 2:09 a.m.
And she's gone, just vanished. Her remains have never been found to this day.
So that first disappearance, deeply unsettling. But then just 4 months later, that unease turns into, well, absolute dread. June 9th, 1996. Jane Rimmer, 23 years old, she disappears from the very same area.
Yes, security footage caught her outside the Continental Hotel. 12:04 a.m. Her friends had already left in a taxi just moments before.
Okay, and this is when Task Force Macro gets set up.
This is the trigger, yes. But even with this big task force forming, 55 days pass, and then her body is found, August 3rd, 40 kilometers south of Perth in bushland near a place called Wellard.
Right, so this is the confirmation, grim confirmation.
Undeniable.
Yeah.
A serial predator was definitely operating in Claremont.
And he wasn't finished. 9 months go by and then he strikes again. Ciara Glennon, 27, a lawyer. She disappears March 15th, 1997.
And again, same area. Last seen walking along Sterling Highway is about 12:30 a.m. Witnesses saw her talking to someone in a light-colored vehicle, unidentified,
And following the pattern.
following the pattern. Her body was found 19 days later, April 3rd, but this time it was 40 kilometers north near Eglinton.
Wow, okay. So two bodies found 80 kilometers apart in opposite directions from Claremont.
Exactly. Yeah. But the disappearances themselves, strikingly similar circumstances. After Ciara Glennon, the police finally went public confirming they were hunting a serial killer. They put up a massive reward, $250,000, big as the state had ever offered.
Which brings us back to Task Force Macro. You said it was huge, eventually over 100 investigators. But just having a big team didn't mean instant results, did it? What was their first sort of angle?
Well, their initial thinking seemed logical at the time, but maybe a bit too focused. They looked hard at those unidentified cars seen near the victims, naturally. And because Sarah Swayers had called a taxi,
They went after the taxi drivers.
they zeroed in on them, yes. Launched this massive fingerprinting and DNA testing exercise. Thousands of licensed drivers. It actually did have one positive outcome. They found 78 drivers with criminal histories and got them delicensed. So taxi standards definitely got stricter after that.
Okay, so safer taxis, maybe, but still no killer. And the investigation just drags on for years. Lots of public pressure, criticism.
Immense pressure.
Yeah.
And you start seeing these, well, questionable tactics creeping in. They brought in international experts, profilers, even an imported lie detector machine. And most controversially, they sent out these questionnaires to 110 people they called persons of interest, asking really confrontational questions,
Like,
including the blunt, almost aggressive question, are you the killer?
wow, that sounds desperate. Less investigation, more psychological prodding.
It really showed the frustration building up. But I think the biggest issue, the biggest drain on time and resources, was this really long, narrow focus on one guy early on, Lance Williams.
Lance Williams, why him?
He drew attention because he drove his car around Claremont late at night. A lot, sometimes circling the area like 30 times in a night. It seemed suspicious, obsessive behavior.
So Macro spends years and presumably a lot of money watching this one guy
intense surveillance
Mm.
for years, only to finally announce in late 2008 that he was no longer a person of interest.
That's a huge amount of time wasted, isn't it? A massive opportunity cost, chasing one lead while the real killer is out there.
Absolutely. The task force was kind of stuck for years, really. They got fixated on this behavioral profile, someone seemingly obsessed with the crime locations. They were chasing a psychological ghost when the answer ultimately was forensic. It was physical evidence.
Right, waiting under a microscope, basically.
Essentially, yes.
So, okay, years go by. Task Force macro scales down. The case moves to the Special Crimes Squad. What was it? What was the actual breakthrough? The needle in the haystack that finally broke this open after nearly 20 years.
It wasn't announced until December 2015. And the clue came from Jane Rimmer's body, recovered way back in '96. They'd re-examined evidence with newer technology and found fibers, very specific fibers.
Specific how?
Specific enough to be traced to one particular type of vehicle, a Holden Commodore, the VS Series 1 model.
And that was the moment.
That was the pivot. Everything changed at that car link.
And that fiber clue points them towards Bradley Robert Edwards, arrested at his house in Kewdale, December 22nd, 2016. And this is where his history, his past violence, suddenly becomes critical, connecting dots that have been separate for years.
Exactly, because when they charged him, it wasn't just for the Rimmer and Glennon murders. They also charged him with 2 earlier unsolved attacks, a 1988 break-in and unlawful detention in Huntingdale,
Yep.
and a 1995 attack in Claremont itself, the aggravated sexual penetration of a 17-year-old girl.
And that 1988 case, that held the key, didn't it? The DNA time capsule.
It really did, because during that 1988 Huntingdale attack, the intruder dropped something while fleeing, a stolen kimono,
And on the kimono.
the attacker's DNA. That sample had been sitting in the police database for almost 30 years, waiting for a match. It was the crucial link, preserved long before the Claremont murders even happened. And Edwards, later on in 2019, he actually pleaded guilty to those 5 earlier charges, the non-murder ones. It just cemented the pattern.
And then critically, February 2018, Edwards is also charged with the willful murder of Sarah Spires, victim number 1, even though her body was still missing.
The whole picture of his violent trajectory finally snapped into focus. The investigation had its man.
Right. So let's move to the trial. It was long, 7 months, ran from November 2019 to June 2020. And because of all the publicity, the graphic details, they decided on a judge-alone trial, Justice Stephen Hall. No jury. What did that mean procedurally?
Well, in really high-profile, sensitive cases like this, it's often done to avoid the risk of a jury being swayed by emotion or media coverage. It meant Justice Hall alone had to weigh all the evidence, especially the really complex forensic stuff, and decide the facts and the legal points. It put the focus squarely on the science and the legal arguments.
And the prosecution's case seemed to rest on 3 main pillars: circumstantial evidence, those fibers, and the DNA. Let's start with the circumstantial part, the Telstra connection.
Yeah, this part is fascinating because it speaks to his methods. Edwards worked for Telstra, the big telecom company, as a technician. And crucially, between 1996 and 1998, his work vehicle was a white VS Series station wagon with Telstra logos on it.
The same type of car linked by the fibers?
Exactly. The prosecution argued this wasn't just coincidence. The Telstra van was his cover. Driving a recognizable work van allowed him to be in odd places late at night, like near crime scenes, without drawing suspicion. People would just assume he was working.
That's clever. Calculated.
Very. They even had a project called the Telstra Living Witness Project to track his vehicle use. And a key witness, a security guard, remembered seeing a Telstra van parked, oddly, at Carricutta Cemetery for no apparent reason, he said, both after the 1995 Claremont attack and before Sarah Spires disappeared in early '96, placing him near relevant locations.
Okay, so that ties him to the car type and the area circumstantially. But the convictions for Rimmer and Glennon really hinged on the physical evidence, starting with those fibers from inside the car.
Yes, the fiber evidence was incredibly powerful because of its specificity. Tiny blue polyester fibers matching the carpet in the back of Edwards' specific Telstra VS Commodore wagon were found on both Jane Rimmer's body and Ciara Glennon's body.
Both victims.
Both victims. The defense argue, contamination in the lab, or maybe the fibers were common, but finding multiple fibers from the boot of his specific car, likely where the bodies were transported on 2 separate victims, found miles apart, years after the crimes. That's very hard to explain away as coincidence or contamination.
And then the clincher.
Yeah.
The DNA.
This was the moment everyone had waited decades for, really.
Mm-hmm.
Bradley Robert Edwards' DNA was found under Ciara Glennon's fingernails,
Suggesting a struggle.
indicating she fought back, yes. And critically, This DNA profile was an exact match to the DNA profile recovered from that stolen kimono dropped way back in the 1988 Huntingdale attack.
Wow, bridging nearly a decade.
It was the smoking gun. That DNA sample, preserved from 1988, directly linked his earlier violence to the physical evidence found on Sierra Glennon in 1997. It tied it all together.
That forensic bridge, 88 to 97, that's what this deep dive really highlights as the game changer. Okay, so all this evidence is presented. What was the final verdict? Handed down September 24th, 2020.
Justice Hall found Bradley Robert Edwards guilty. Guilty of the murders of Jane Remmer and Sierra Glennon. For those two, the evidence, particularly the fibers and DNA, was deemed overwhelming.
But not Sarah Spires.
Correct. He was found not guilty of the murder of Sarah Spires.
That's striking, given the pattern, the timing.
It is. Justice Hall actually stated in his judgment that it was more likely Edwards was involved in her disappearance than not. He fit the pattern. But without her body, without any direct forensic link like the fibers or DNA found on the other victims, the very high standard of proof needed for a murder conviction beyond a reasonable doubt just couldn't be met in her specific case.
Right. So for the two murders he was convicted of, the sentence came down on December 23rd, 2020.
Life in prison, with a non-parole period set at 40 years.
A sentence that certainly closed a huge, painful chapter for Western Australia. Though, as the investigation noted, there's still a lingering question about whether Edwards might be linked to other unsolved disappearances around that time, people like Julie Cutler, missing since '88, or even later ones like Lisa Brown or Sarah McMahon.
Yeah, the real significance here is how it was solved. It wasn't the massive initial task force effort, ironically. It came down to those tiny forensic traces preserved meticulously and analyzed years later with advanced technology. It needed all those different threads, the circumstantial Telstra van evidence, the specific fiber matches, and that absolutely crucial DNA link from 1988 all woven together to finally bridge the decades and secure the convictions.
It's an undeniable relief, that conviction, for so many people in WA. But like you said, the case still feels partially unresolved because Sarah Spires is still missing, and there's that official not guilty verdict for her murder. And it leaves a really important question for you, the listener, to think about. What does it mean for such a huge, long-running serial killer investigation when the very first crime, the one that kicked everything off, remains formally unproven even when the judge says the convicted man was more likely involved? That question, that sense of incomplete justice, still hangs over this case. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.